The last of the day's light, a warm and fading terracotta, lingers on the turquoise water of the bay as a heavy merchant galley. Its single great sail, now neatly furled, glides through the outer channel. The air, growing cool, carries the mingled scents of sea salt, the cedarwood of the hull, and the distant promise of wood smoke from the city's hearths. Its journey, perhaps from the silver, rich coasts of Iberia, is ending now in the quietest of arrivals. The creak of timber and the gentle lap of water against the bow, the only sounds to mark its passage. The crewmen move as silent shadows upon the deck, their work performed with a practiced economy of motion, born of long weeks at sea. As the vessel slips through the narrow passage into the perfect circle of the Chthon, the famed naval harbor, the world seems to contract into a basin of profound tranquility. Here the water lies like a disk of polished obsidian, reflecting the first tentative stars and the imposing silhouette of the Admiral's Island at its very center. Along the concentric quays, small points of lamplight begin to bloom one by one, their warm glow illuminating the grand arches of the ship, sheds, and the faces of family waiting for their sailors' return. A quiet testament to the rhythms of commerce and faith that are the city's very lifeblood. Good evening, and welcome back to Empires at Dusk. Tonight, we drift into the quiet memory of Carthage, a forgotten empire whose story is a poignant elegy written on the Mediterranean wind. From its legendary founding by a queen of Tyre on the sun-warmed coast of Africa, it grew into a formidable republic, built not on legions, but on the steady rhythm of the sea and the intricate webs of commerce. Its great ships plied the waves from the Pillars of Hercules to the distant, misty shores of Britain, returning with the silver and tin that fueled its immense wealth and influence. And yet, this world of trade and faith would find itself locked in a mortal struggle with a rising Italian power, a rivalry that ended not in defeat, but in annihilation, leaving us to reconstruct its story from the ashes and the biased words of its conquerors. Before the first Phoenician ship ever scraped its keel upon the pale sands of Tunisia, the land itself lay under a sun of immense and ancient power, a territory of baked ochre earth and silver, green olive groves. Along the coast of North Africa, the world was shaped by the rhythm of a dry wind that carried the scent of wild thyme and the distant, rhythmic bleating of goats from the high pastures where the air was thin and clear. This was the domain of the peoples known to the Romans as Berbers, and to themselves as the Amazigh, the free people. A collection of tribes and nascent kingdoms whose presence was etched into the landscape as deeply as the dry riverbeds that scored the hills. Their lives were woven into the fabric of this place, a tapestry of pastoral tradition, fierce independence, and a profound, unspoken understanding of the harsh beauty that surrounded them. One traveling through these lands would not have found great cities of marble, but rather clusters of settlements built from the earth itself. Their flat, roofed houses of packed clay and rough, hewn stone clinging to the sides of hills for protection, and for a commanding view of the surrounding territory. The Amazigh were masters of the horse, their swift, resilient ponies carrying them across the vast, undulating plains, and their knowledge of the hidden wells and secret passes of the Atlas Mountains was a guarded inheritance passed down through generations. Their society was one of clans and chieftains, of seasonal migrations between grazing lands, and of small-scale agriculture in the fertile valleys where wheat and barley could be coaxed from the soil, their roots reaching deep for the precious, scarce water that sustained all life in this arid expanse. Their world was far from isolated, however, as they maintained their own intricate networks of trade, moving salt from the desert interior towards the coast, and exchanging leather goods, dates, and intricately woven woolen cloaks with their neighbors. They were skilled metallurgists in their own right, working with bronze and iron to forge the tools and simple, elegant jewelry that adorned them. Their designs, often echoing the geometric patterns found in their pottery and textiles. This was a land with a deep and resilient culture, a place of quiet dignity and long memory, which had watched the sun rise and set over the shimmering line of the Mediterranean for countless centuries. Long before the arrival of strangers from across the sea, out upon that great sea, the known world was in a state profound and unsettling transformation, following the great unraveling of civilizations that historians now call the Bronze Age collapse. The old empires that had once held sway, the mighty Hittites of Anatolia and the new kingdom of Egypt, had receded like a great tide, leaving a vacuum of power and a disruption of the ancient trade routes that had been their lifeblood. The sea, once a carefully controlled highway for imperial galleys, became a space of new opportunity and considerable peril, a vast and open arena where daring and resourceful peoples could now forge their own destinies, far from the shadows of the old palaces and their now silent armies. It was an age of movement, of displacement, and of genesis, as new powers began to stir in the quiet harbors and hidden coves of the Mediterranean world. From the narrow coastal plain of the Levant, a sliver of fertile land, pressed between the cedar-clad mountains of Lebanon and the sea, came one such people, the Phoenicians. Hailing from a string of vibrant, fiercely independent states like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, they were not conquerors in the traditional sense, for their ambitions were not fixed upon the acquisition of land through force of arms. Instead, they were the supreme merchants, artisans, and mariners of their age, a Semitic people whose culture was oriented entirely towards the sea, which they viewed not as a boundary, but as a boundless road, leading to wealth and knowledge. Their homes were crowded, bustling port cities, where the air was thick with the smells of exotic spices, drying fish, and the pine tar used to caulk the hulls of their remarkable ships. These vessels, sturdy, round, hulled merchant ships known as galloi, were marvels of ancient engineering, built from the prized cedar of their hinterlands, and designed to carry the maximum amount of cargo with a minimal crew. The Phoenicians were peerless navigators, venturing out beyond the sight of land and steering their course by the constellations, most notably the steadfast pole star, which the Greeks would come to call the Phoenician star in their honor. Their voyages were driven by a relentless commercial imperative, a search for the raw materials that their own narrow homeland lacked, and which the burgeoning markets of the Near East desperately craved. They were weavers of a new commercial web, one that would slowly, methodically, begin to bind the entire Mediterranean basin together. The pressures from the east were immense, as the powerful land-based empires of Assyria and later Babylonia began to expand, demanding heavy tribute and encroaching upon the traditional autonomy of the Phoenician cities. This, combined with a growing population and the finite resources of their homeland, propelled them westwards in a steady, systematic expansion. They did not send armies, but rather small groups of colonists and merchants, seeking not territory to rule, but strategic locations to establish permanent trading posts. Their quest was for the silver of Iberia, the copper of Cyprus, and, it is believed, the tin from the distant, mist-shrouded islands of Britain. A crucial component for the making of bronze, each new settlement was another knot in their ever-expanding net, a safe harbor for their ships and a new market for their goods. It was from this world of maritime enterprise and political exile that the founding legend of Carthage emerges, a story whispered down through the ages by Greek and Roman writers. The tale begins in the great city of Tyre, with a princess named Elissa, known to posterity by the name Dido. Her brother, the avaricious King Pygmalion, had murdered her wealthy husband, the high priest of Melkart, in order to seize his fortune. Learning of the plot and fearing for her own life, Dido gathered a small group of loyal nobles and their families, secretly loaded her husband's treasures onto a fleet of ships, and slipped out of the harbor under the cover of darkness, her back turned forever to the home that had betrayed her. After a long and arduous voyage that took them first to Cyprus, her fleet of exiles sailed west, following the trade routes their countrymen had already established along the southern shores of the Mediterranean. They were searching for a new home, a place where they could be safe and free to build a life far from Pygmalion's reach. The surviving accounts suggest that around the year 8014 BCE, their wary ships rounded a promontory on the North African coast and sailed into a wide, sheltered bay. Before them lay a peninsula of gently rising land, a place of good anchorage and defensible high ground, a landscape that seemed to promise both prosperity and security. And it was here that Dido resolved to make her stand. The local chieftain of the Amazigh tribes who controlled this land, a man whom Roman sources call Airbus, was said to be wary of these newcomers and unwilling to part with any significant territory. And so Dido, drawing upon the Phoenician gift for shrewd negotiation, made a modest request. She asked for only as much land as could be encompassed by a single oxide. The chieftain, amused by what seemed a trivial and harmless proposal, readily agreed. A traveler observing the scene would have noted the quiet composure of the exiled queen as her servants brought forth a large oxide. And the growing curiosity of the local tribesmen as they watched what would happen next. Then, with meticulous care, Dido's followers sliced the hide into a single, impossibly thin and continuous strip, a thread of leather thousands of feet in length. Beginning at the coast, they used this strip to outline a vast perimeter, stretching it around the crest of the most prominent hill on the peninsula, an area large enough to found a proper settlement. The chieftain, bound by his word and outwitted by Dido's clever interpretation of their agreement, had no choice but to honor the bargain. On this hill, which would forever after be known as the Bursa, meaning hide, in Greek, the foundations of the new city were laid, a settlement born not of violence, but of ingenuity. From this legendary beginning arose Qart-Hadasht, the Phoenician name for what they had built, which simply meant the new city. The first years would have been a time of immense labor, as the refugees from Tyre transformed their patch of African soil into a home. The initial settlement would have been humble, a collection of tents and lean tos giving way to more permanent structures of timber and the local honey-colored stone. The air would have carried the sounds of a Semitic tongue mingling with the native Amazigh language, the sharp clang of hammers on stone, and the constant murmur of the nearby sea, a comforting and familiar presence for these seafaring people. The scent of cedar smoke from their sacrificial fires would have drifted on the breeze, a fragrant reminder of the distant mountains they had left behind. This new city did not, at first, dominate its neighbors, but rather existed in a delicate and carefully negotiated balance with them. The archaeological evidence and surviving texts suggest that for many years, the people of Qart-Hadasht paid an annual tribute to the local Amazigh tribes for the right to occupy the land and to farm the surrounding plains of the Medjurda Valley. In return for this rent, the Phoenicians offered access to a world of goods previously unknown on this coast: fine pottery, glassware of stunning color and clarity, tools of iron, and above all, their magnificent textiles dyed with the precious Tyrian purple, a color worth more than its weight in gold. A cautious symbiosis developed, one of trade and tribute, a relationship built on mutual, if sometimes grudging, benefit. From this small foothold, secured by a queen's wit and sustained by the steady profits of trade, one of the ancient world's great powers would eventually arise. The location was supremely strategic, commanding the narrow strait between Sicily and Africa, the very throat of the Mediterranean, allowing its future masters to control the passage of all maritime traffic between the East and the West. Here, on this sun-drenched peninsula, the quiet seeds of a great commercial empire were sown, an empire of ships and silver, of faith and fortitude, whose story would become inextricably bound to the destiny of the entire Mediterranean world, and whose eventual, terrible fall would echo for millennia. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk. For the first century of its existence, the city of Qart-Hadasht remained a daughter looking eastward, a distant outpost whose fortunes were still tethered to the great Phoenician metropolis of Tyre. The ships that arrived from the Levant brought not only goods, but also dictates, fashions, and family ties, reinforcing the sense that this new settlement was merely a single, albeit prosperous, node in a much older network. Yet, as the decades turned into a century, the world began to shift around them, and the currents of power that had flowed from Phoenicia for so long started to be redirected by the gravitational pull of new, land-based empires. From the east came the armies of Mesopotamia, first the Neo-Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, their campaigns pressing ever harder upon the coastal cities of the Levant, culminating in a protracted and draining siege of Tyre itself. Later, the vast Persian Empire would swallow the region whole, transforming the once proud maritime cities into vassals. Their fleets opted for imperial ambitions that had little to do with the quiet pursuit of commerce. For the Carthaginians, watching from afar across the breadth of the Mediterranean, this slow decline of their mother city was a source of both anxiety and profound opportunity. the steady stream of guidance and authority from the east dwindled to a trickle, leaving the colony's leaders to solve their own problems and navigate their own alliances with the Libyan tribes who surrounded them. There was no single moment of declared independence, no dramatic severing of the umbilical cord. Rather, it was a gradual process of standing on their own feet. A slow turning of the city's collective gaze from the past in the east to the untapped potential of the west. Refugees from Tyre and other Phoenician cities, fleeing the turmoil, arrived in Carthage not as superiors, but as supplicants, bringing with them their skills and their capital, which further enriched the burgeoning North African power. It was in this crucible of change, under the warm African sun and fanned by the sea winds, that Carthage ceased to be a colony and began to forge its own distinct identity, one rooted in its new homeland and oriented towards a maritime destiny of its own making. With this newfound autonomy came the necessity of creating a stable and effective system of governance, one suited to a state whose lifeblood was the meticulous management of risk and the steady accumulation of wealth through trade. The monarchy of its Phoenician ancestors, personified in the legend of its founding queen, gave way to a more pragmatic and collective form of leadership, an oligarchic republic that placed power in the hands of the city's most successful and influential families. These were the great merchant houses and the landed aristocrats, whose vast agricultural estates in the fertile hinterland produced the grain and olives that fed the city and supplied its export markets. From amongst these elite clans, the citizenry annually elected 2 chief magistrates, known as Sophites, a title that echoes the Hebrew word for judge. These were not kings or military dictators, but rather civic administrators and chief justices who presided over the state for a single year, their power carefully circumscribed to prevent any one individual from accumulating too much influence. The true heart of Carthaginian power, however, lay not with the Sophites, but within the cool, shaded halls of its councils, particularly the powerful body that Roman writers would later compare to their own Senate. Here, a council of elders, likely numbering in the hundreds and drawn from the wealthiest and most venerable families, would deliberate on matters of state, from the dispatching of a trading fleet to the declaration of war. Their debates, one imagines, were not fiery, impassioned affairs, but rather measured and cautious discussions, the air thick with the scent of expensive cedar wood from their paneled chambers and the quiet rustle of fine linen robes. These were men who understood balance sheets and long-term investments, and they viewed the state itself as the ultimate enterprise to be managed with prudence. foresight, and a clear-eyed assessment of profit and loss. Beneath this supreme council, other committees and boards of magistrates managed the specific functions of the city, from the treasury to the provisioning of the navy, creating a complex but remarkably stable bureaucracy that endured for centuries, ensuring the continuity of Carthaginian policy long after individual suffetes had completed their terms. From this secure political foundation and the magnificent anchor of its growing port, Carthage began to spin a web of influence and control that would eventually span the whole of the Western Mediterranean. This was not an empire of marching legions, intent on conquering and assimilating vast swaths of territory in the Roman style, but a thalassocracy, an empire of the sea built upon a network of coastal trading posts, secure anchorages, and strategic islands. The primary impulse was commercial, a desire to monopolize the lucrative trade routes that brought precious metals from the far corners of the known world. Carthaginian ships, their sturdy hulls smelling of pine pitch and salt, pushed westward past the Pillars of Hercules, the Straits of Gibraltar, establishing a presence along the Atlantic coast of Africa and, most importantly, in southern Iberia. From the rich mines of Spain, they secured a near monopoly on the supply of silver, a metal that became the backbone of their currency and the engine of their wealth, its dull gleam filling the holds of their vessels on the long voyage home. Their reach extended northwards as well, as their traders sought out the sources of tin, a vital component for the forging of bronze. These intrepid sailors, whose navigational knowledge was a closely guarded state secret, likely reached the shores of Brittany and may even have made contact with the remote, mist-shrouded peninsula of Cornwall in Britain, trading wine, textiles, and glassware for the raw tin that was so essential for the tools and weapons of the age. Closer to home, they asserted direct control over a string of strategically vital islands. The fertile shores of Sardinia, the rugged hills of Corsica, and the small but crucial Balearic Islands all fell under Carthaginian hegemony, serving as stepping stones and forward bases that secured their shipping lanes. In North Africa, their influence radiated out from the capital, establishing control over the other Phoenician settlements along the coast and asserting dominance over the inland Berber kingdoms, from whom they levied troops and exacted tribute, creating a deep, productive hinterland to support the ever-growing city. This maritime dominion was less a contiguous territory and more a string of pearls, each one a valuable port or resource, all connected by the invisible threads of the sea lanes that Carthage so masterfully controlled. Yet, this westward and northward expansion inevitably brought Carthage into contact and competition with another great seafaring and colonizing people, the Greeks. For centuries, Greek city-states had been planting their own colonies across southern Italy, a region they called Magna Graecia, and along the eastern and southern coasts of Sicily. It was on this large, triangular island, lying directly in the heart of the Mediterranean, that the ambitions of these two great trading cultures would collide, sparking a series of conflicts that would smolder and flare for over 200 years. The Sicilian Wars were not a single, continuous struggle, but a long and draining series of campaigns, punctuated by periods of uneasy peace, as Carthage and the various Greek city-states, most notably the powerful and aggressive Syracuse, vied for control of the island's rich agricultural land and its strategic ports. The conflict was a grinding, attritional affair, a persistent friction on the western frontier of the Greek world and the eastern frontier of the Carthaginian sphere. The wars established a deep and lasting enmity, particularly with Syracuse, which saw itself as the champion of Hellenic civilization against the barbarian Phoenicians. Battles were fought on land and at sea. Cities were besieged and sacked, and treaties were made and broken with a grim regularity that shaped the military and diplomatic posture of Carthage for generations. For the Carthaginians, Sicily became an obsession, a vital buffer zone and a forward base, but also a constant drain on the treasury and a source of political instability at home. The need to raise, fund, and deploy large mercenary armies for the Sicilian campaigns gave rise to a new class of powerful generals whose ambitions sometimes clashed with the cautious merchant oligarchs of the council. The surviving accounts, written almost exclusively by their Greek and Roman enemies, paint these wars as a clash of civilizations. But for the merchants in Carthage, it was more likely viewed as a costly but necessary business expense. The price of securing the trade routes and preventing a powerful, unified Greek state from dominating the central Mediterranean and threatening their lifeline to the sea. The back and forth struggle for Sicily would define Carthage's foreign policy for centuries, hardening its military and creating the deep-seated rivalry that would eventually set the stage for its even greater contest with Rome. As its wealth swelled and its strategic commitments deepened, the city of Carthage itself transformed into a metropolis worthy of a great maritime power. Its growth culminating in one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the ancient world, its magnificent double harbor system. A traveler arriving by sea would first pass into a large, rectangular commercial port, a bustling hive of activity where hundreds of merchant ships could moor simultaneously. Here, The air would have been thick with a symphony of sounds and smells, the creak of wooden hulls against stone quays, the shouts of sailors in a dozen different languages, the scent of spices from the east, of Spanish silver being unloaded, and of fragrant Tunisian olive oil being carefully decanted into amphorae for export. Warehouses and porticos lined the quays, their shaded depths filled with goods from across the known world. A tangible display of the city's commercial might, all managed with the quiet efficiency of a well-run corporation. But beyond this public, commercial basin lay the city's true jewel. Its secret heart of naval power, accessible only through a narrow, defensible channel. This was the legendary Carthage, a perfectly circular artificial harbor, reserved exclusively for the military fleet. From the center of this circular basin rose a small island, upon which stood the admiral's headquarters, a tall structure that afforded a commanding, panoramic view of the entire complex and, beyond it, the open sea. Radiating out from this central island like the spokes of a colossal wheel were sheds, vaulted chambers, carved into the perimeter of the harbor, each one designed to house a single warship. In front of each shed stood a pair of tall ionic columns, giving the entire complex the appearance of a grand, circular portico floating on the water. Historians believe there were over 200 of these sheds, allowing Carthage to house its entire navy of triremes and quinquiremes, safe from spies, storms, and surprise attacks. Here, the ships could be repaired, refitted, and provisioned in secret. One might imagine the quiet, methodical work within these vaulted halls, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer on metal, the scent of hot pitch being applied to a hole, the low murmur of shipwrights inspecting timber. The water of the Carthage, sheltered and still, would have reflected the sky like a dark, polished mirror. The silent, empty sheds, waiting to disgorge the cities, might at a single command. This harbor was more than just a feat of engineering. It was the ultimate expression of the Carthaginian worldview. Secure, ordered, immensely powerful, and with its greatest strengths, carefully hidden from the view of outsiders. The true measure of Carthage in its ascendancy was not to be found in the pronouncements of its enemies, but in the quiet, thrumming life of its capital. A city that clung to the North African coast like a pearl on the edge of a great blue robe. To walk its streets during the height of its power, in the long sun-drenched century, before the final conflict with Rome, was to immerse oneself in a world built on the tides of trade and the certainty of faith. A visitor arriving by sea would first pass through the heavily fortified commercial port, a vast rectangular basin teeming with the merchant ships that were the city's lifeblood, their hulls stained dark by long voyages to Iberia, to Sicily, and to the mysterious Tin Isles far to the north. Here, the air was a dense tapestry of scents, a mixture of the sharp brine of the Mediterranean, the sweet, resinous perfume of cedar wood from the shipyards, and the cloying smell of fish drying on racks under the relentless sun. The sounds were a constant. Low chorus, the rhythmic thud of mallets on timber from the workshops, the shouts of stevedores in the guttural Punic tongue, and the gentle, ever-present lapping of water against stone quays. From the port, one might proceed inland, leaving the open sky behind, to enter the dense warren of the lower city. The streets here were narrow and often unpaved, designed to create shade and channel the sea breezes through the urban canyon. Tall, whitewashed apartment blocks, known as insulae, rose several stories high, their upper floors sometimes leaning so precariously over the thoroughfare that neighbors could almost shake hands across the gap. These were the homes of the city's artisans, its sailors, its laborers, a vibrant and crowded population, living cheek by jowl, their daily lives spilling out into the alleyways in a cascade of noise and activity. The ground floors were often given over to workshops and taverns, from which would emanate the smells of baking bread, the metallic tang of a blacksmith's forge, or the fermented scent of cheap wine. It was a district of constant movement, a human river flowing through stone banks, where the wealth of the empire was not displayed in gold, but felt in the sheer, overwhelming press of life itself. Climbing the gentle slope of the Bursa Hill, the character of the city began to change, the air growing cleaner and the sounds more muted. This was the ascent into the Megara, the sprawling and luxurious aristocratic quarter, a stark contrast to the dense quarters below. Here, the narrow alleys gave way to wider, more orderly streets, lined with the grand villas of the merchant, princes and the land, owning elite. These were not ostentatious palaces designed for public display, but private, inward-facing compounds, protected from the outside world by high, featureless walls. Behind these barriers, however, lay an entirely different world of serene courtyards, cooled by the splashing of fountains and shaded by the deep green leaves of fig and pomegranate trees. A guest, once admitted through the heavy wooden doors, would find themselves in a tranquil oasis of colonnaded walkways. Floors decorated with intricate mosaics depicting scenes from the natural world, and walls painted with delicate frescoes. The scent of jasmine and rose would hang heavy in the air, a private perfume to mask the more robust odors of the port city below, a testament to a fortune so vast it could afford not just luxury, but seclusion. The spiritual life of the city was as foundational as its commercial enterprise. centering on a pantheon of deities inherited from their Phoenician ancestors, but adapted to their new African home. At the heart of this faith stood the divine couple, Baal-Hamon, the stern lord of the heavens and weather, and his consort Tanit, others powerful lunar and fertility goddess, who came to be seen as the city's special protectress. Their symbols were everywhere, carved into stone markers, stamped onto pottery, and worn as amulets to ward off evil. Tanit's emblem in particular, a simple triangle topped by a horizontal bar and a circle, was a ubiquitous sign of Punic identity, a geometric prayer for prosperity and protection. Shrines and temples dotted the city, from small neighborhood altars where one might leave a simple offering of grain or oil to the great, imposing temples on the Bursa Hill, where priests in clean linen robes conducted elaborate rituals to the sound of lyres and pipes, the air thick with the smoke of expensive incense burning in bronze braziers. For the average Carthaginian, the gods were not distant concepts, but active participants in daily life, their favor to be courted for a safe sea voyage, a bountiful harvest, or the birth of a healthy child. Yet, it is in the discussion of Carthaginian religion that we encounter the most profound and somber shadow cast over its memory, for it is inseparable from the place known as the Tophet. Located on the southern edge of the city, this sacred precinct has been the source of intense scholarly and emotional debate for centuries. Archaeological excavations have unearthed thousands of small urns buried under stone markers or stelae, many of which are inscribed with dedications to Baal-Hamon and Tanit. Inside these urns are the cremated remains of the very young, mostly newborns, but also some infants up to a few years of age. Surviving accounts from Greek and Roman authors, who were uniformly hostile to Carthage, speak in horrified tones of institutionalized child sacrifice, describing rituals where the city's elite would offer their own children to the gods in times of great crisis to appease their divine wrath. The archaeological evidence is undeniable in its physical reality, yet its interpretation remains fraught with difficulty. Some historians argue that the Tophet was simply a special cemetery for infants and children who died of natural causes, a heartbreakingly common occurrence in the ancient world, and that the dedicatory stela were expressions of parental grief, entrusting their lost children to the care of the gods. They suggest that the Roman and Greek accounts are little more than lurid propaganda, designed to dehumanize their powerful rival and justify their own aggression. Others, however, point to the sheer scale of the deposits and the language of the inscriptions, which often use terms associated with vows and offerings, to argue that some form of ritual sacrifice, however limited or infrequent, did indeed take place. Perhaps it was a practice reserved for the direst of emergencies, a desperate last resort for a city facing famine or invasion. The cool stone of the excavated stele offers no easy answers. Standing in silent testament to a belief system we can now only glimpse through a dark and distorted lens. A quiet place of profound sorrow. Whatever its true purpose may have been, the truth likely lies somewhere in the complex and uncomfortable space between these two interpretations. A part of the Carthaginian soul that remains forever shrouded in mystery and pain. If faith was the soul of Carthage, then commerce was its beating heart, and the city's magnificent circular harbor, the Qart-Hadasht, was the primary artery. This remarkable feat of engineering was actually two interconnected harbors, a large, rectangular commercial port, and a smaller, circular military port hidden behind it, accessible only by a narrow channel. It was from the commercial harbor that the true power of Carthage flowed. A relentless tide of goods and materials drawn from across the known world. Great, broad-beamed ships with their single square sails and banks of oars for navigating tricky harbors would arrive laden with raw wealth. From the mines of southern Iberia, which Carthage controlled with a jealous grip, came a seemingly endless river of silver. The heavy ingots stacked deep in the holds, providing the bullion that underpinned the entire Punic economy. From the west coast of Africa, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, daring voyages brought back gold, ivory tusks that gleamed like polished bone, and exotic animal hides. The flow of goods was not merely one of extraction. It was a complex web of exchange that made Carthage the central clearinghouse of the Western Mediterranean. Sardinia and Sicily, when under Punic control, sent mountains of grain to feed the burgeoning population of the capital. From the far northern lands, perhaps even the misty shores of Britain, came the tin that was essential for the production of bronze. In return, Carthaginian merchants exported the fruits of their own lands and workshops, fine pottery, intricate glasswork, and the famed agricultural produce of their fertile hinterland. But their most prized export, the one that carried the city's name across the seas, was a small container of dye. This was the legendary Tyrian purple, extracted in a laborious and fault-smelling process from the glands of thousands of murex sea snails. The resulting dye produced a color of unparalleled richness and permanence, a deep and vibrant purple that did not fade in the sun, making it the ultimate status symbol, a color reserved for kings and emperors, and a source of immense wealth for the merchants who controlled its supply. Standing on the quayside, one would have witnessed a microcosm of the globalized world Carthage had built, a constant, noisy, and wonderfully odorous exchange that was the true engine of its empire. The society that this commercial empire created was, unsurprisingly, one defined by wealth and mercantile acumen. At the very pinnacle were the great merchant families, aristocratic clans, whose power derived not from ancient lineage, in the Roman sense, but from the vastness of their fortunes and the reach of their trading networks. These families dominated the Council of Elders and provided the candidates for the two chief magistrates, or suffetes, who were elected annually to govern the state. It was a system that has been described as a plutocracy, a government of the wealthy, where political influence was inextricably linked to commercial success. A successful general like Hannibal Barca was an exception, for the most part. Power in Carthage was wielded by men whose battlefields were the marketplace, and whose weapons were contracts and connections. They were pragmatic, unsentimental, and profoundly skilled in the arts of negotiation, logistics, and risk assessment, qualities that made their city a commercial powerhouse, but sometimes left it vulnerable to the more single-minded military focus of its rivals. Beneath this ruling class was a complex and stratified society. A substantial middle class of skilled artisans, shopkeepers, and independent farmers provided the backbone of the urban and rural economy. The shipwrights who built the city's fleet, the masons who raised its walls, the weavers who produced its textiles, and the potters who created its distinctive amphorae were all essential components of the Punic system. Below them were the mariners and sailors, the men who spent their lives on the open water, a famously tough and experienced cadre who possessed an unrivaled knowledge of the Mediterranean's winds and currents. Their skills were the essential link in every commercial chain, and they formed a distinct and often unruly subculture within the city. At the very bottom of the social pyramid, as in all ancient societies, were the enslaved. These were individuals captured in war, purchased in distant markets, or born into bondage, and their forced labor was fundamental to the functioning of the Carthaginian economy. They worked on the great agricultural estates, toiled in the silver mines of Spain, manned the oars of the warships, and served in the households of the wealthy. Their lives and labor forming the unseen and unacknowledged foundation upon which the city's glittering prosperity was built. While the city itself was a marvel of urban life, the enduring strength of Carthage also rested firmly on the rich, fertile land of its African hinterland. The coastal plain of what is now northern Tunisia was a veritable breadbasket, blessed with good soil, reliable winter rains, and a climate perfectly suited to the classic Mediterranean trinity of crops, grain, grapes, and olives. The Carthaginian aristocracy, for all their focus on maritime trade, were also savvy agricultural entrepreneurs, transforming the countryside into a patchwork of vast, highly organized estates known as latifundia. These were not simple family farms, but large-scale agribusinesses managed with a scientific precision that was admired even by the Romans. The Carthaginian writer Mago produced a comprehensive agricultural treatise in 28 volumes that was considered the definitive work on the subject in the ancient world. It was so respected that after destroying the city, the Romans made a point of saving Mago's books and having them translated into Latin. A journey out from the city walls would have taken a traveler through a landscape of profound and managed abundance. Endless fields of wheat and barley would shimmer gold in the summer sun, their bounty destined not just for the city's bakeries, but for export across the sea. On the rolling hillsides, row upon row of gnarled olive trees, their leaves a dusty silver, green, would stretch to the horizon. Their fruit pressed to produce the golden oil that was a staple of diet, lighting, and hygiene. And in the valleys, vast vineyards would be heavy with grapes, producing wines that were prized throughout the Mediterranean basin. This agricultural wealth provided Carthage with a crucial degree of self-sufficiency, ensuring that the city could feed its people, even if its maritime trade routes were disrupted. It was this rich territory, this source of food, wealth, and manpower that Rome coveted so deeply. And it was the struggle for control of this land, as much as for the sea lanes, that would ultimately define the epic and tragic conflict between the two great powers of the Western Mediterranean. In the end, perhaps the greatest tragedy of Carthage's fall is not the toppling of its walls, but the silencing of its voice. We are left to reconstruct this vibrant civilization almost entirely through the writings of its conquerors and rivals. A process akin to trying to understand a person by reading only the court transcript of their bitterest enemy. The Punic language, a Semitic tongue closely related to Phoenician and Hebrew, which once echoed in the markets and councils of the great city, is now effectively lost. It survives only in a handful of inscriptions, in the names of people and places, and as scattered loanwords in other ancient texts. The rich body of Carthaginian literature, including the famed agricultural works of Mago and likely histories, poems, and philosophical treatises, was almost entirely destroyed in the final sack of the city in 146 BCE. The great libraries, which may have held the Carthaginians' own account of their history, their beliefs, and their view of the world, were put to the torch. Their accumulated knowledge turned to ash and smoke. What we are left with is a portrait of Carthage painted in the stark, unforgiving colors of Roman propaganda and Greek suspicion. To them, the Carthaginians were treacherous, greedy, cruel, and impious, a caricature designed to justify their own imperial ambitions. The very term Punic faith became a Roman slur for treachery. We have no Carthaginian account of the Punic Wars, no Hannibal's memoirs to set against the histories of Livy and Polybius. We have no response from a Punic priest to the accusations of child sacrifice. We have no poem celebrating the beauty of a sunset over the Kothan. No play wrestling with the dilemmas of a merchant's life. No philosophical text exploring the Punic concept of the divine. The golden age of Carthage, for all its tangible wealth and power, has come down to us as a silent film. We can see the magnificent sets, the bustling crowds, the grand gestures, but we can no longer hear the dialogue. We are left to wander through the ghost of a city, admiring the foundations and the fragments, but straining to hear a voice on the wind that will never speak again. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk. For a long and prosperous age, the great sea of the Mediterranean had seemed to belong to the ships of Carthage, their wide cedar planked hulls a familiar sight from the shores of Iberia to the markets of the Levant. The world, as seen from the high terraces of the Bursa citadel, was a known and comfortable quantity, a network of ports and trade routes, governed by treaties, profit, and the appeasement of the gods. Yet, across the narrow straits on the Italian peninsula, a different kind of power had been quietly consolidating. A power built not on the fluidity of water, but on the solidity of earth, its foundation being the disciplined tread of the legionary and the unyielding logic of the paved road. This was the Roman Republic, and for centuries its destiny and that of Carthage had run on parallel courses, close but never touching, each absorbed in its own sphere of influence and expansion. The island of Sicily, lying like a stepping stone between them, was always destined to be the place where these two worlds would finally collide, a beautiful and tragic stage for the drama that was to unfold. A traveler visiting the island in the early 3rd century before our era would have found a place of intoxicating contrasts, where the sharp scent of Carthaginian cedar mingled with the fragrance of Greek olive groves and the dialects of Phoenician sailors could be heard alongside the languages of local Sicels in the bustling port towns. It was a prize of immense value, a fertile breadbasket whose harvests could feed armies, and a strategic anchor from which to project naval power across the central Mediterranean, making it an object of desire for any ambitious state. The initial disputes were small, local squabbles over the control of minor cities. Yet they carried the weight of an unavoidable, gathering storm. The first tremors of a geological shift as the continental power of Rome began to press against the maritime empire of Carthage. There was no single, dramatic declaration of war, no grand moment of decision that one could point to as the singular cause, but rather a slow, creeping escalation, a series of diplomatic failures and military provocations that made conflict all but inevitable. It was the unfortunate collision of two expanding systems, each with its own logic, its own pride, and its own profound conviction in its right to exist and to prosper. The Suffites of Carthage, accustomed to resolving disputes through negotiation and payment, found themselves dealing with a Roman Senate that was uncompromising and legalistic, while the Romans, in turn, viewed the Carthaginian dominance of the sea as an obstacle to their own burgeoning ambitions. The First War, when it finally came in 264 BCE, was therefore not a war of passion, but of grim necessity. A long and brutal accounting that would test the very foundations of both republics and leave the sun, drenched fields of Sicily stained with blood. The conflict that followed was a grueling affair, stretching on for more than 2 decades and consuming a generation of young men, emptying treasuries with a terrifying efficiency. Carthage, the supreme naval power, found itself unexpectedly challenged on its own terms, as the Romans, with a stubborn and almost frightening resolve, set about building a fleet from scratch, reputedly modeling their first warships on a captured Carthaginian quinquereme. One can almost hear the endless sounds of this effort echoing from the shipyards of Italy, the rhythmic hammering of thousands of mallets and the rasp of saws on fresh timber, all driven by a singular will to master the sea. The Carthaginians, in turn, were forced to wage a protracted land war in Sicily, a type of fighting for which their mercenary armies were prepared, but which ran contrary to the state's commercial soul, a slow drain on resources with no immediate profit to be shown in the ledgers of the city's merchant houses. The war became a relentless meat grinder, a monstrous engine of attrition that demanded ever more ships, ever more silver, and ever more lives. The early Roman naval victories, achieved through the novel and brutish tactic of using a boarding bridge called the corvus to turn sea battles into infantry engagements, were a profound shock to the Carthaginian command. They were accustomed to a fluid, graceful form of naval warfare based on ramming and maneuver, and the Roman method seemed to them a crude and ugly affair. Yet its effectiveness was undeniable. For the citizens of Carthage, the war became a distant but constant pressure, a source of quiet anxiety felt in the rising cost of grain and the increasingly frequent religious processions, seeking the favor of Baal Hammon for the armies and fleets so far from home. The initial confidence that their maritime expertise would guarantee a swift victory slowly eroded, replaced by a weary understanding that they were locked in a desperate struggle with a rival whose tenacity was as boundless as its reserves of manpower. When the end finally came, with a decisive naval defeat at the Agates Islands in 241 BCE, it was almost a relief. But the peace that followed was a bitter draught. Carthage was forced to abandon Sicily entirely, surrendering its oldest and most profitable sphere of influence in the central Mediterranean, and watching it fall into the hands of its rival. The flow of Sicilian grain and the revenue from its ports, which had nourished the city for centuries, was cut off forever, leaving a void in the empire's economy. Perhaps more devastating still was the indemnity demanded by Rome, a sum so vast it threatened to bankrupt the state, a public and lasting monument to their humiliation. The terms were harsh and unyielding, a clear signal from the Romans that they were now the dominant power in the region, and Carthage was expected to accept its new, diminished status. The triumphant return of the Roman legions was matched by the quiet, mournful return of the Carthaginian survivors, their ships gliding back into the Chthon, not with spoils of war, but with the heavy burden of defeat. The deep vulnerabilities of the Carthaginian state, papered over during the long years of prosperity, were now exposed with brutal clarity by the war's aftermath. The most immediate and dangerous of these was the city's reliance on foreign mercenaries to fight its battles, a system that had functioned well enough when the treasury was full, but which proved to be a catastrophic liability in the face of sudden insolvency. The vast army that had fought in Sicily, a hardened and polyglot force of Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, and Greeks, was transported back to Africa to be paid off and discharged, but the money was simply not there. The state, crippled by the Roman indemnity, attempted to negotiate, to haggle with the soldiers over their long, overdue wages, treating them as they might any other business creditor. A fatal miscalculation of the mood among tens of thousands of armed and desperate men. What followed was a paroxysm of violence, so savage that later historians would call it the Truceless War, a conflict without rules or mercy. The unpaid mercenaries rose in a massive revolt, joined by disaffected Libyan communities who had long chafed under Carthaginian rule. And for 3 terrifying years, Carthage found itself besieged in its own heartland, cut off from the agricultural lands that fed it. A visitor to the city during this time would have felt a palpable sense of dread hanging in the sea air, heavier than any morning fog. The familiar sounds of commerce in the great harbor would have been replaced by the frantic noise of barricades being built and the distant, ominous war cries of the rebel army, whose campfires could be seen glowing on the horizon each night like a malevolent constellation. The war against the mercenaries was a fight for sheer survival, and it revealed the deep chasm between the citizenry of Carthage and the armies who fought in their name. Unlike Rome, which could call upon legions of citizen, soldiers bound by patriotic duty, Carthage had outsourced its defense. And now, the very instruments of its power had turned against it with a terrifying fury. The stories that filtered back from the front lines, likely exaggerated but rooted in a horrifying reality, spoke of unspeakable atrocities on both sides, of a conflict that descended into a spiral of mutual hatred and butchery. It was a war that would leave a permanent scar on the Carthaginian psyche, a traumatic memory of just how close the city had come to complete annihilation, not at the hands of a foreign rival, but from the very men it had hired to protect it. Out of the crucible of this desperate conflict, a new political force began to emerge, forged in the heat of battle and defined by a profound sense of grievance against both the external enemy, Rome, and the perceived incompetence of the ruling oligarchy within Carthage itself. The man who finally succeeded in crushing the mercenary revolt was a general of remarkable talent and ruthless efficiency named Hamilcar Barca, a member of an influential aristocratic family, but one whose reputation was now elevated to heroic status. His victory granted him and his supporters, who became known as the Barcid faction, an almost unassailable degree of political prestige and influence, setting the stage for a deep and lasting internal rivalry that would define the next generation of Carthaginian politics. This rivalry pitted the Barcids against the more traditional, conservative faction of the landed aristocracy, a group often personified by the statesman Hanno the Great. Hanno and his supporters, it is believed, represented the old way of thinking, advocating for a return to the commercial and agricultural pursuits that had long been the bedrock of Carthaginian prosperity, and arguing for a policy of appeasement and peaceful coexistence with Rome. They saw the Barcids' military ambitions as a dangerous and reckless path that could only lead to further conflict and ruin. The debates that must have taken place within the Council of Elders would have been charged with unspoken tensions. The cool marble of the chamber, echoing with quiet but fiercely competing visions for the future of the Republic, a struggle between the merchant's ledger and the soldier's sword. Hamilcar Barca, for his part, seems to have concluded that the old ways were no longer viable. He had seen firsthand the weakness of the state, its inability to pay its own soldiers, and the humiliating peace imposed by a triumphant Rome. He believed that Carthage could never be secure as long as it remained economically and militarily inferior to its Italian rival, and that the only path to recovery lay not in a return to the past, but in the forging of a new future. Frustrated by the political opposition in Carthage and sensing that his ambitions could not be contained within the city's ancient walls, he made a momentous decision. He would take his veteran army, loyal to him personally, and carve out a new Carthaginian empire, a new source of wealth and power, far from the watchful eyes of the Roman Senate and the carping of his rivals at home. His chosen destination was the Iberian Peninsula, a vast and rugged land known for its fierce tribes, and more importantly, for its rich, untapped deposits of silver and other metals. In 237 BCE, Hamilcar crossed the strait and began a systematic campaign of conquest and consolidation, a project that would be continued after his death by his son, in Law Hasdrubal the Fair, and later by his own son. This was not the old style of Carthaginian expansion, which had focused on establishing coastal trading posts. This was a new and more Roman model of territorial dominion, the creation of a province to be ruled, taxed, and exploited for the benefit of the new Barcid power base. The clink of silver being mined from the mountains of Spain soon became the sound of Carthage's resurgence, the metallic lifeblood of a new war machine, being painstakingly assembled in secret. The wealth that flowed from the Spanish mines allowed the Barcids to maintain a large and experienced standing army, independent of the state treasury in Carthage, and to build a new capital in Spain, the city of Qart-Hadasht, or New Carthage, a testament to their ambition. From this fortress, they could prepare, train, and plan for the future, driven by a singular, unifying purpose. This purpose, this cold and burning ambition, is best encapsulated in a story passed down to us by Roman historians. A scene that has all the weight of legend, but which likely holds a kernel of profound truth. It is the story of Hamilcar and his young son, Hannibal, a boy of only 9 years old. The surviving accounts suggest that before Hamilcar departed for Spain, he was in a temple making a sacrifice to Baal-Hamon, asking the god's blessing for his great enterprise. He called his young son to his side, and in the solemn quiet of the sacred precinct, with the air thick with the scent of incense and burnt offerings, he asked the boy if he wished to accompany him. When Hannibal eagerly assented, Hamilcar led him to the altar and made him place his small hand upon the sacrifice, and there, in the presence of the gods, he had his son swear a solemn oath that as soon as he was old enough, he would be an enemy of Rome, and that he would hold this enmity for the rest of his life. Whether the scene unfolded in precisely this manner is something we can never know for certain. But the oath itself represents a powerful truth. It was the formal passing of a legacy, the transference of a father's deep seated resentment and strategic vision to his child. It was not a vow made in a fit of anger, but a cold, calculated dedication of a life to a single, all-consuming task. The reversal of the verdict of the First War and the humbling of the power that had inflicted it. This quiet moment in a temple was the true beginning of the second and far more terrible Punic War. The cracks that had appeared in the foundation of the Carthaginian state after its first defeat had not been mended. Instead, they had been filled with the molten anger of the Barcid clan, which would cool and harden into the sharp point of a sword aimed directly at the heart of Italy. The final chapter of Carthage's story is not a sudden collapse, but rather a long, withdrawing breath. A magnificent and terrible exertion that would ultimately leave the city exhausted and vulnerable before the unyielding will of its rival. It begins not with an ending, but with a daring new offensive, an act of such audacious ambition that it has echoed through military history for millennia, a testament to the singular genius of Hannibal Barca. The Second Punic War, initiated not in the familiar waters of the Mediterranean, but in the icy, unforgiving peaks of the Alps, represented Carthage's greatest gamble, a decision to move the conflict away from the sea lanes and into the very heartland of the Roman Republic. One can almost feel the thinning air and the biting cold that must have greeted the Carthaginian army as it began its legendary ascent. A vast column of men and animals, including the famous war elephants, moving slowly upwards into a realm of rock and ice utterly alien to the sun-warmed shores of North Africa. The surviving accounts suggest a journey of immense hardship, with the narrow paths slick with frost, the local tribes hostile, and the elephants, those living symbols of Punic power, struggling with the treacherous footing and the unfamiliar chill that clung to the high passes, their low groans a mournful counterpoint to the whistling wind. This was not merely a military march. It was a psychological masterstroke, designed to shatter Roman confidence by appearing where no enemy was thought possible. Descending from the clouds like a wrathful god. And descend he did, for upon reaching the fertile plains of the Po Valley, Hannibal and his depleted but hardened army began a campaign of unparalleled brilliance, moving through the Italian peninsula not as a ponderous invader, but as a swift and deadly phantom. For years, he outmaneuvered and defeated every Roman army sent against him, his tactical acumen becoming a source of dread in the Senate and in the households of Rome itself. This string of victories reached its horrifying apex in the summer of 216 BCE on a hot, dusty plain in southern Italy near a small village named Cannae. There, Hannibal faced a Roman force of almost double his own numbers. A massive consular army, assembled with the express purpose of crushing the Carthaginian menace once and for all. What followed was not simply a battle, but a perfect and terrible work of military art. A double envelopment so complete that it remains a textbook example of tactical perfection. Hannibal allowed his center to bow inwards, absorbing the furious Roman charge, while his elite cavalry swung around the flanks, a closing net of bronze and iron that sealed the legionaries within a suffocating pocket of death, from which there was no escape. By the end of the day, as the Italian sun set over the field, the dust began to settle on a scene of almost unimaginable slaughter. The Roman army effectively annihilated, and the Republic brought to the very brink of utter collapse. And yet, in the aftermath of this staggering victory, when it seemed that the gates of Rome itself lay open to him, Hannibal hesitated, and the course of history shifted on its axis. For all its losses, the Roman state did not fracture. Its allies did not, for the most part, desert its cause, and the city itself did not sue for peace. Instead, the disaster at Cannae forged a new and grim resolve within the Roman spirit, a stubborn refusal to be broken. A new strategy emerged, one of caution and patience, forever associated with the dictator. Quintus Fabius Maximus, who argued for avoiding direct, pitched battles with Hannibal at all costs. The Fabian strategy was one of attrition, of shadowing Hannibal's army, harassing his foragers, and slowly, methodically, strangling his supply lines, turning the Italian countryside into a cage. While Hannibal remained a terrifying and undefeated presence in Italy, a lion trapped but still lethal, the wider war began to turn against Carthage. A brilliant young Roman general, Publius Cornelius Scipio, understood that Hannibal could not be defeated by confronting him directly, but by dismantling the empire that sustained him. Scipio took the war to Carthage's most valuable province, Spain, and over several years of masterful campaigning, he systematically captured the silver mines and coastal cities that funded Hannibal's war effort, peeling away the foundations of Carthaginian power piece by painful piece. With his Spanish power base secured, Scipio then did the unthinkable, mirroring Hannibal's own strategy by proposing to invade North Africa itself, forcing Carthage to recall its greatest general for the defense of the homeland. The inevitable confrontation, the meeting of the two greatest commanders of the age, finally took place in 202 BCE on the dry plains of Zama, a short distance from Carthage itself. It was a somber affair, a final roll of the dice for a conflict that had consumed generations. Hannibal, now weary and fighting with an army of raw levies mixed with his hardened veterans, faced Scipio, whose legions were disciplined, battle-tested, and equipped with a new understanding of how to counter the Carthaginian war elephants. The initial charge of Hannibal's elephants, which had once spread such terror, was rendered ineffective as the Roman maniples simply opened their ranks to let the great beasts pass through, riddling them with javelins from the sides. The battle that followed was a hard and grinding contest of infantry, a brutal struggle between Hannibal's tired veterans and Scipio's confident legionaries. In the end, it was the superiority of the Roman cavalry which had driven its Carthaginian counterparts from the field before returning to smash into the rear of Hannibal's line. That proved decisive. The encirclement that Hannibal had perfected at Cannae was now turned against him, and his army, caught between two fronts, finally broke. Hannibal himself escaped, but his army was destroyed, and with it, Carthage's ability to wage war. The peace treaty that followed was harsh, stripping Carthage of its overseas empire, its navy, and its military autonomy, reducing the once proud maritime power to the status of a Roman client state, forbidden to raise an army without Rome's permission. The 50 years that followed the defeat at Zama were a long, melancholic twilight for the city of Carthage. Though militarily neutered, the city's commercial spirit proved remarkably resilient, and it began to experience a surprising economic recovery. Its wharves once again busy with merchant ships, and its workshops humming with industry. A traveler arriving in this period might have noted the strange quiet in the Chthon, the circular military harbor now, holding only a handful of petrol boats, a silent monument to lost power. Yet this very recovery, this stubborn refusal to simply fade away, was perceived in Rome not as a welcome sign of stability, but as a potential future threat. The sentiment was relentlessly stoked by conservative voices in the Senate, most famously by the stern figure of Cato the Elder, a man who had fought in the war and harbored an implacable hatred for his old enemy. He was said to have ended every speech he gave, regardless of the topic, with the same grim refrain: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. This phrase, repeated over and over, became a slow, rhythmic drumbeat in Roman politics, a constant reminder of old fears, and a justification for future aggression, wearing down all opposition until the final terrible act became an accepted inevitability. The pretext for the Third Punic War, when it finally came, was a flimsy one, a border dispute with a Roman, allied Numidian king that Carthage, in desperation, responded to with military force, technically violating its treaty. It was the excuse Rome had been waiting for. The final war was not a contest, but an execution. An enormous Roman army landed in North Africa in 149 BCE with a single, unambiguous command: the complete and utter annihilation of the city of Carthage. The initial Roman demands were that the Carthaginians surrender all their weapons, which they did, hoping to appease the aggressor. Then came the final, impossible ultimatum. The citizens must abandon their city entirely and resettle 10 miles inland, away from the sea that was their lifeblood and their very soul. It was a demand for cultural suicide, and it was refused. The gates of the city were closed, and the people of Carthage, now unarmed, began to forge new weapons, melting down statues for bronze and tearing down buildings for timber. The women reportedly cutting their long hair to be woven into ropes for the catapults. The siege that followed lasted for 3 years, a heroic but doomed struggle against overwhelming force. The final assault in the spring of 146 BCE was a brutal, merciless affair. The Roman legions, under the command of Scipio Aemilianus, the adopted grandson of the victor of Zama, breached the walls and began a methodical, street-by-street slaughter that lasted for 6 days. The fighting moved through the narrow alleyways and across the rooftops of the great city, the air thick with the smell of smoke and the sounds of destruction. When the fighting finally ceased, the few remaining survivors, numbering around 50,000, were rounded up from the ashes of the Bursa citadel and sold into slavery. By order of the Roman Senate, the city that had once ruled the Western Mediterranean was systematically demolished, its buildings torn down, its stones scattered, and its fields, according to a persistent but likely apocryphal legend, sown with salt to ensure that nothing would ever grow there again. The great circular harbor was filled in, the library of 1,000,000 scrolls was burned, and a curse was pronounced upon the land. The quiet elegy for the maritime empire had found its devastating final chord. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk. And so, the story of Carthage draws to a close, not in a gentle fading, but in the sudden, violent extinguishing of a flame that had burned for nearly 7 centuries. A final act of will imposed by a rival who decreed that the city must be destroyed. The silence that now hangs over the coast of modern Tunisia is perhaps Carthage's most profound legacy, a quiet testament to the totality of its erasure. Where the sea breeze no longer carries the scent of cedar from a merchant's hull, or the distant clang of a shipwright's hammer from the circular coffin. What was once a vibrant metropolis, a nexus of trade and power that challenged the known world, was ploughed into the earth. its foundations sound with salt in a gesture of ultimate finality. Leaving behind a void on the edge of the Mediterranean, we are left to sift through the ruins and piece together a ghost. For the true loss was not merely of stone and marble, but of a voice, a perspective, a complete world of thought and expression. The libraries of Carthage, which may have held epics to rival Homer's, or histories to challenge Herodotus, were almost entirely lost. Their vellum and papyrus turning to dust and smoke, their language silenced forever. We are therefore forced to see this great mercantile republic primarily through the eyes of its antagonists, the Romans and the Greeks, who wrote its history after ensuring it could no longer write its own, leaving us with a portrait of a society painted by the very hands that undid it. Still, some faint whispers endure, carried on the currents of time, echoes of what was so deliberately dismantled. The strategic genius of Hannibal Barca still commands admiration. A general whose victories at places like Cannae are studied as masterworks of military art. A brief and brilliant flash of Punic supremacy. Others call archaeological outlines of the Great Harbor and the dense grid of city streets give us a map of a lost world, while the enigmatic stones of the Taffets, warmed by the North African sun, stand as solemn markers of a faith in Baal Hammon and Tanit that we can now only dimly apprehend, its deepest rituals and beliefs forever beyond our certain grasp. Ultimately, the tale of Carthage is a quiet, mournful lesson in the fragility of civilization, a reminder that history is not always a slow, organic decline, but can be a story of deliberate and absolute removal. Its fall marks the end of a possibility, the closing of a door on a Mediterranean world that might have developed along a different axis, one balanced between two great powers, instead of being dominated by one. The great maritime empire, born of Phoenician daring and sustained by the silver of Spain and the tin of distant isles, now sleeps beneath the fields and suburbs of Tunis, its memory a soft and sorrowful elegy on the evening air. Rest well. We will meet again at dusk. 2.